Some men spend their whole lives running from the past, only to find it buried right beneath their feet. Elias Boone learned that lesson the hard way when he bought $200 worth of worthless desert and discovered something that would change everything. The folks in Salvation Ridge laughed when he traded his last money for that barren land. Too dry for farming, too empty for anything but rattlesnakes and regret. But one hot afternoon, his shovel struck wood instead of rock. What came up from that hole were bones wearing sheriff's stars, and a book filled with names of men still walking the streets, men who thought their secrets died 20 years ago. Now those men are coming for him, and Elias has to decide what matters more, his life or the truth. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe. Tomorrow brings something special. Elias Boone had seen 58 winters, and every one of them had left its mark. His face was weathered like canyon stone, creased deep around eyes that had learned to read sign in snow and track elk through timber so thick a man could walk past his own shadow. His hands were scarred from trap lines and rope burn, calloused in ways that spoke of a life lived hard and honest. He stood just under 6 feet, lean as jerky, with shoulders that still carried strength even if they ached some on cold mornings. His hair, more salt than pepper now, hung past his collar, and his beard was trimmed close enough to be respectable, but wild enough to show he didn't much care what town folk thought. He'd spent 30 years in the high country of the Rockies, trapping beaver and marten, living in cabins so remote that months would pass without seeing another human face. It was the kind of life that either broke a man or refined him down to something essential. Elias had been refined. He knew how to survive on what the land provided, how to read weather in the way aspens shivered, how to move through wilderness without leaving more than a whisper. But the winters had grown harder these past few years, and his joints complained more with each season. A man could only fight the mountains for so long before they won, so he'd come down, packed what little he owned onto a mule, and pointed himself south, looking for country that didn't try to kill you 6 months out of the year. He'd heard about land going cheap in the territories, places where a man could build something simple and live out his days without the snow trying to bury him every November. That's how he found himself in Salvation Ridge on a blistering afternoon in July of 1885. The town wasn't much to look at. A single street of sun-bleached buildings squatting in the desert like they were too tired to stand up straight. False front shops with paint peeling in long strips. A saloon with bat-wing doors that hung crooked on their hinges. A general store, a land office, and a courthouse that looked more permanent than anything else. Built from local stone that had probably outlasted 3 generations of the wooden structures around it. Maybe 200 souls called this place home. Though Elias suspected that number was generous, the desert stretched in every direction, broken only by distant mountains that shimmered in the heat like they weren't quite real. Scrub brush and cactus dotted the pale dirt, and the sun hammered down with a weight that made a man understand why lizards moved slow. It was different from the mountains, but Elias found he didn't mind it. At least here you could see trouble coming from a long way off. He'd spent his first 2 days in town getting a feel for the place, sleeping under the stars at the edge of the settlement, taking meals at the boarding house run by a quiet widow named Sarah Kemper. She was a handsome woman in her late 40s, with grey threading through dark hair she kept pinned up practical. She moved with the efficiency of someone who'd learned not to waste motion, and her eyes carried the kind of sadness that spoke of loss she'd made peace with, but never quite forgotten. The boarding house food was simple, but good. Beans and cornbread, occasionally chicken or salt pork. Sarah didn't ask many questions, which Elias appreciated, but he caught her watching him sometimes with an expression he couldn't quite read. Curiosity, maybe, or concern. It was on his 3rd day that Elias walked into the land office, a cramped room that smelled of dust and old paper. Behind a desk piled with ledgers sat a thin man with spectacles that kept sliding down his nose. His nameplate read Walter Sims, land agent. "Help you?" Sims asked without much interest, not looking up from whatever he was writing. "Looking to buy some land," Elias said. That got the man's attention. Sims looked up, took in Elias's worn buckskins and weathered face, and his expression shifted to something between amusement and pity. Well now, you come to the right place for that. How much land you looking for? Don't need much. Few acres. Somewhere I can build a cabin, keep to myself. Sims nodded slowly, pushing his spectacles up. Most of the good parcels are already claimed. River access, timber, that sort of thing. But I've got some plots available further out. What's your price range? Elias pulled a leather pouch from his coat and set it on the desk. The coins inside clinked with a sound that spoke of finality. Got $200. That's all of it. The land agent's eyebrows rose. He opened the pouch, counted the coins. Gold and silver mixed, probably every cent the mountain man had saved in 3 decades of hard living. Sims let out a low whistle. 200 will get you something, sure enough. He pulled out a large map, unrolled it across the desk, weighing down the corners with a rock and an inkwell. His finger traced across the paper. Now you want my honest advice? There's a nice 10 acres here by Willow Creek. Some shade, water year-round. What about that? Elias interrupted, pointing to a section marked in faded pencil near the edge of town. Sims's finger stopped. He looked at where Elias was pointing, and his expression went carefully neutral. That's Plot 47. Old Silver Spur Saloon used to be there. Used to be? Burned down. 20 years back, near about. Nothing there now but foundation stones and sand. How much? Well, Sims hesitated. Mr. Boone, that land's not worth farming. No water, no shade, nothing but how much? Elias repeated, quiet but firm. The land agent sighed. $150. But, mister, I'm telling you, I'll take it. 200, you said, gets me something. That plot? And I keep the extra 50 for supplies. Sims stared at him for a long moment, then shrugged. Your money. He pulled out a deed form and began filling it in with careful script. Can I ask why you want that particular plot? Elias didn't answer right away. He couldn't have explained it if he tried. Just a feeling in his gut, the same instinct that had kept him alive in grizzly country and warned him when avalanches were building on distant slopes. Something about that empty plot called to him in a way he didn't fully understand. Seems quiet, he finally said. Word spread fast in a small town. By the time Elias walked out of the land office with his deed, a small crowd had gathered in the street. Men in dusty work clothes, women with market baskets, even a few children stopped to stare. That's him, someone muttered. The fool who bought the old saloon lot. Laughter rippled through the crowd, not cruel exactly, but not kind either. The laughter of people watching someone make a mistake they'd never make themselves. A large man with a thick mustache and an expensive suit stepped forward from the saloon's shade. He had the bearing of someone used to being listened to, and the crowd quieted when he spoke. You must be the mountain man, he said, voice carrying easy authority. I'm Mayor Gideon Marsh. Welcome to Salvation Ridge. Elias nodded. Obliged. Heard you bought the old Silver Spur plot. Marsh's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Can I ask what you plan to do with it? Build a cabin. Live quiet, on that land. Another man spoke up from the saloon doorway. Broad-shouldered, ruddy-faced, wearing an apron that marked him as the proprietor. Friend, that dirt won't grow so much as a weed. Nothing there but memories and dust. Suits me fine, Elias said. Mayor Marsh studied him for a moment, and Elias got the sense of being measured, assessed, filed away in the man's memory. Well, if you need anything, my door's always open. We're a welcoming community here in Salvation Ridge. The words were friendly enough, but something in the mayor's tone made the hair on Elias's neck prickle. He'd learned to trust those warnings. A younger man wearing a tin star approached. Couldn't have been more than 25, with an earnest face and eyes that hadn't yet seen enough to make them hard. I'm Sheriff Tom Hadley. Just want you to know we keep a peaceful town here. Any trouble, you come find me. Don't expect there'll be trouble, Elias said. Good, good. Hadley seemed relieved. Where you staying? My land, I reckon. More laughter from the crowd. Even the sheriff smiled, though he tried to hide it. Elias collected his mule from where he'd tied it and walked through town toward his property, aware of eyes following him. By tomorrow, he figured, the story would have spread to every household. the crazy mountain man who spent his last dollars on worthless desert. Let them talk. He'd spent 3 decades with only wind for company. Human judgment rolled off him like rain off waxed canvas. The plot was exactly as described. Nothing but sand and scattered timbers, the charred foundation stones of what had once been a building. Elias walked the property line, getting a feel for the land. The sun was dropping toward the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of copper and gold. He found a spot with a clear view in all directions and started setting up camp. As he worked, his hand brushed against the knife at his belt, a bone-handled blade his father had given him 40 years ago. It had been his companion through every season in the high country, had cleaned more game than he could count, had saved his life twice that he could remember. The handle was worn smooth from use, fitted to his grip like it was part of his hand. Some men carried photographs or letters. Elias carried this knife, and it told the whole story of where he'd been and what he'd survived. He built a small fire as darkness settled, made coffee in a battered tin pot, and sat watching the stars emerge. The desert night was different from mountain nights, warmer, drier, with different sounds. No owls hooting in timber, no elk bugling in distant meadows. Just wind moving across sand and the occasional cry of something wild and hunting. But underneath the peace, Elias felt something else. A tension in this town, like a wire pulled tight. The way Mayor Marsh had looked at him, the nervous energy in the crowd's laughter. The fact that this land, so close to town, had sat empty for 20 years. He sipped his coffee and wondered what had really happened to the Silver Spur. Saloon, wondered why no one wanted this. Ground and wondered, not for the first time since arriving, if coming down from the mountains had been a mistake after all. 3 days after signing the deed, Elias woke before dawn and decided it was time to start clearing the land. He'd spent the previous days observing the town, learning its rhythms, and letting people get used to seeing him. Now it was time to get to work. The sun wasn't yet above the eastern mountains when he started. He'd brought basic tools with him from the high country, a good shovel, an axe, a hammer, the kind of implements a man needed to carve out a life anywhere. His plan was simple: level enough ground for a small cabin, maybe 12 feet by 12 feet. Nothing fancy, just 4 walls and a roof to keep the weather off. The desert morning was cool, almost pleasant, but Elias knew that wouldn't last. By midday, the heat would be brutal. He worked methodically, clearing away the larger pieces of charred timber first, stacking them to one side. Might be useful for something later. The foundation stones he left where they were, good solid rock, probably quarried from the nearby hills. He could build around them, use them as part of his new cabin's base. By the time the sun cleared the mountains, he'd worked up a decent sweat. He paused to drink from his canteen, looking around at what he'd accomplished. Not much yet, but it was a start. The blackened timbers told a story of fire, and he found himself wondering about that night 20 years ago. What had started the blaze? Had anyone died? He pushed the thoughts aside and went back to work. The shovel bit into the sand with a satisfying crunch. Elias fell into the rhythm of it, drive the blade down, lever up the load, toss it aside. Drive, lever, toss. His muscles remembered this kind of work, from building trapline cabins, from digging food caches in frozen ground. The desert sand was easier than mountain soil, at least. No roots to fight, no rocks bigger than his fist. He was maybe 3 feet down, working on leveling a particularly stubborn high spot. When the shovel struck something that didn't feel like sand or stone, the sound was wrong. Not the crack of metal on rock, but a hollow thunk. Like hitting wood. Elias stopped, wiped sweat from his forehead, and looked down into the shallow pit he'd dug. He could see it now, a dark line in the sand where his shovel had scraped away the surface. He knelt down, brushed away more sand with his hand, and felt his breath catch wood. Definitely wood. Smooth planks running horizontal, fitted tight together. He stood back, looking at the area with fresh eyes. The foundation stones made a rough rectangle, maybe 20 feet by 30 feet, the footprint of the old saloon. He was working near what would have been the back corner, away from where the front door would have faced the street. Elias began digging more carefully now, using his hands as much as the shovel. The wood extended in both directions. After 20 minutes of work, he'd uncovered an area about 6 feet by 4 feet. The planks were thick, 2 inches at least, and though weathered, they seemed solid. More importantly, they were clearly deliberate. This wasn't debris from the fire. This was a structure, a cellar door. Had to be. His pulse picked up despite himself. Cellars meant storage. Storage meant maybe something worth finding. But more than that, he felt that same instinct that had drawn him to this plot in the first place. Whatever was down there, it was the reason this land had sat empty for 2 decades. The sun climbed higher. The temperature rose. Elias kept working, clearing the sand from around the entire cellar entrance. He found iron hinges on one side, badly rusted but still intact. On the other side, a hasp and what remained of a heavy lock, broken and corroded. By noon, he had the entire door exposed. He sat back on his heels studying it. The desert had preserved it better than rain country would have. The wood was dry but not rotted, the gaps between planks packed with sand that had filtered down over the years. Should he open it? Part of him said to leave it alone. If something was buried here, there was probably a reason. But another part, the part that had survived 30 winters in grisly country by being curious and careful, wanted to know what was down there. He looked around. No one was watching from town. Everyone was inside, hiding from the midday heat. This was his land, his property. Whatever was in that cellar belonged to him now. Elias found a stout piece of timber from the debris pile and used it as a lever. The hinges protested, metal squealing against metal, but they held. The door was heavy. It took all his strength to lift it. Sand cascaded down into the darkness below as the door swung up and back, finally coming to rest against the ground with a thud that seemed too loud in the desert quiet. A smell rose from the opening. Dry air, dust, and something else. Something old and still. Elias fetched his lantern from camp, lit it, and approached the opening carefully. Stone steps led down into darkness. The walls were rock, carefully fitted. Someone had built this to last. He descended slowly, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. The lantern threw dancing shadows on the walls. The air was cooler down here, noticeably so. 8 steps down, then he was standing on a hard dirt floor. The cellar was bigger than he'd expected, maybe 15 feet square, with a ceiling high enough that he could stand upright. His lantern light revealed shelves along one wall, empty now, except for a few broken bottles. A barrel in one corner long since gone dry. And in the center of the space, a table, 3 chairs around the table, and in those chairs, 3 skeletons. Elias froze, lantern held high. The bones were brown with age, still held together, mostly by the clothing that draped them. Simple work clothes, canvas pants, cotton shirts gone nearly to dust. But that wasn't what made his blood run cold. Each skeleton wore a star. Tarnished silver badges pinned to what remained of their shirts. Lawmen, 3 lawmen, sitting at a table in a sealed cellar beneath a burned saloon. Dead for 20 years, Elias moved closer, his mountain man's practicality overcoming the initial shock. The bones showed no sign of violence, no bullet holes in skulls, no obvious breaks. The men were arranged almost naturally, as if they'd been sitting here having a quiet drink when death came. 3 tin cups sat on the table before them, and between the cups a deck of cards spread in what might have been a poker hand. But there was something else on the table. Something that had survived the years better than cloth or flesh. A book, leather-bound, closed, sitting in the exact center of the table, like it had been placed there deliberately. Elias reached for it, then hesitated. This felt like crossing a line. These men had died here, been sealed in and forgotten. Whatever that book held, someone had wanted it buried with them. But if they'd wanted it destroyed, they would have burned it with the saloon above. Someone had sealed it down here instead. Preserved it, hidden it, or protected it. He picked up the book. The leather was dry but intact, the binding still solid. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was precise, businesslike. A ledger of some kind. Elias carried it closer to his lantern and began to read. The first entries were mundane, payments for supplies, wages, amounts that seemed to be accounting for some kind of business operation. But as he turned pages, the entries changed. Names he'd heard in town appeared. Gideon Marsh, a man named Silas Calhoun, someone called Bartholomew Crane, and there, near the bottom of one page, Dutch Miller, Silver Spur Saloon. The entries were dated 1865. 20 years ago, he turned more pages, and the nature of the ledger became clear. This wasn't business accounting. This was a record of payments. Hush money. Blood money. One entry made him stop cold. September 15th, 1865, Red Creek incident. 23 miners deceased. Gold shipment recovered. Division of assets. G. Marsh, 4,200. S. Calhoun, 4,200. B. Crane, 3,800. D. Miller, $3,200. J. Hayes, 20,800. Total distributed. 18,200. Below that, in different handwriting, shakier. Payment refused. Deputy James Hadley, Deputy Frank Morrison, Deputy William Cross. Recommended action, elimination. Elias read the entry 3 times, making sure he understood what he was seeing. Red Creek, 23 miners dead. A gold shipment, and 3 deputies who refused payment and were eliminated. He looked up at the skeletons sitting eternally at their card game. 3 deputies, 3 stars. These men had been murdered, sealed in this cellar and left to die, probably during the fire that destroyed the saloon above. And that fire hadn't been an accident. It had been set deliberately to hide this place, to bury the evidence along with the witnesses. The names in the ledger read like a who's who of current Salvation Ridge. Mayor Gideon Marsh, Dutch Miller, who ran the saloon Elias had seen on his first day. And the others, he'd need to ask around, but he suspected they were prominent men in town. 20 years ago, they'd orchestrated a massacre, stolen a gold shipment, and murdered 3 lawmen to cover it up. Then they'd literally buried the evidence and built their lives on top of it. Elias closed the ledger carefully, his mind racing. This changed everything. He'd bought this land looking for peace and quiet, and instead, he'd uncovered a secret that powerful men had killed to protect. He looked at the 3 skeletons again. Deputies. Men who'd stood for something when it mattered. Men who'd paid for that stand with their lives. "I'm sorry," he said quietly to the bones. "Sorry it took 20 years for someone to find you." One of the stars had come loose from its rotted shirt. Elias picked it up, felt the weight of it in his palm. The metal was tarnished, nearly black, but he could still make out the engraving. Deputy Salvation Ridge. He slipped the star into his pocket. These men deserved better than to be forgotten in a cellar. Their story needed telling, but as he stood there in the cool darkness, with his lantern casting long shadows, Elias realized the danger he was in. The men named in that ledger were still alive, still powerful. They'd killed to keep this secret once. They'd do it again. He needed to think, needed to be careful. But first, he needed to get out of this cellar before someone came looking for him. Elias climbed the stone steps back into the blazing sunlight, ledger tucked under his arm. He lowered the cellar door as quietly as he could, then spent the next hour carefully covering it with sand again. To any casual observer, it would look like nothing more than cleared ground. As he worked, he kept watch on the town, and he saw what he'd feared, a figure on horseback sitting motionless on a distant ridge. Too far to see details, but close enough to be watching. Close enough to have seen him open the cellar. The rider sat there for maybe 5 minutes, then turned and rode back toward town at a gallop. Elias's jaw tightened. So they knew, or suspected. Either way, the clock had started ticking. He finished covering the cellar door, made his camp look undisturbed, and tucked the ledger into his bedroll where it wouldn't be visible. Then he sat by his cold fire pit, the deputy's star heavy in his pocket, and watched the sun slide toward the western mountains. 20 years those men had been down there. 20 years the truth had been buried. And now, Elias realized with grim certainty, the men who'd buried it were about to come looking for him. The desert evening was peaceful, but Elias Boone knew better than to trust peace. In the mountains, the quietest moments often came right before the storm hit. He suspected the same was true here. He just had to decide, run, or stand his ground on $200 worth of desert sand and 20-year-old secrets. His hand went to the knife at his belt, then to the star in his pocket. 3 men had stood their ground once. Maybe it was time someone finished what they'd started. Dawn brought clarity and resolve. Elias returned to the cellar site as the sun broke over the eastern mountains. He'd thought long about what Sarah had told him, about her suspicions and her fear. But he'd also thought about those 3 men down there in the darkness, dying for standing up to corruption. He carefully uncovered the cellar door again, descended the stone steps, and looked at the 3 skeletons still sitting at their eternal card game. In the lantern light, they seemed almost peaceful. "I'm taking one of your stars," he said to the silent bones. "A figure you won't mind. Someone needs to remember what you stood for." He removed the badge from Deputy Morrison's remains, brushed the dust from it gently. The metal was tarnished nearly black, but he could still make out the engraving. He placed it carefully in his pocket, next to the one he'd taken yesterday. Deputy Cross's star, 3 stars for 3 men. He'd carry their memory and finish what they'd started. Before he left the cellar, Elias did something else. He made careful notes about the position of the bodies, sketched the layout of the room, and copied several key entries from the ledger. If something happened to the original, there needed to be a backup. He'd learned in the mountains that redundancy kept you alive. Back at the surface, he spent an hour carefully documenting the cellar door itself, measurements, construction details, the condition of the lock, evidence that could be verified later. By mid-morning, he was ready to take the next step. He needed allies, and there was one person in town who might be willing to help if approached correctly: Sheriff Tom Hadley. The young sheriff's office was in a small building attached to the courthouse. Elias found him at his desk, working through paperwork with the kind of concentration that suggested he took his job seriously. "Mr. Boone," Hadley said, looking up with surprise. "What can I do for you?" "Need to talk to you about something. Private, if possible." Hadley's expression grew cautious, but he nodded and gestured to a chair. "Doors closed. What's on your mind?" Elias sat, choosing his words carefully. "Tell me about your father." The change in Hadley was immediate. His face went pale, then flushed. "My father? Why?" "Because I found something on my land that I think you should know about. But first, I need to understand what you know about how he died." "He died in a fire. The Silver Spur Saloon fire in 1865. He was a deputy, trying to save people trapped inside. He was a hero." The words came out defensive, as if Hadley had repeated them so many times they'd become armor. "What if I told you that's not what happened?" "I'd say you should be careful what you accuse people of, especially regarding men who can't defend themselves." Elias studied the young man. He saw genuine belief there, but also something else. A tiny crack of doubt, like Hadley had heard whispers over the years, but never let himself believe them. "Come out to my land," Elias said quietly. "Let me show you something. Then you can decide what you believe." "Show me what?" "The truth about how your father died." They rode out together in silence, Hadley on his horse, Elias walking alongside. The sheriff kept his hand near his pistol, clearly uncertain whether this was wise. Elias couldn't blame him. At the sight, Elias uncovered the cellar door again. Hadley watched, his expression growing more troubled with each shovelful of sand. "There's a cellar under the old saloon?" he asked. "There is. And there's something in it you need to see." They descended together. In the lantern light, the 3 skeletons seemed to take on new meaning, with the dead deputy's son standing there. Hadley stared at them for a long moment, then saw the stars pinned to their rotted clothing. "Dear God," he whispered, "your father is one of these men," Elias said gently, "him and 2 other deputies. They were locked down here and left to die when the building burned." Hadley moved closer, as if drawn by something he couldn't resist. He knelt beside one of the skeletons, and Elias saw him reach out with a trembling hand toward the tarnished star. "Which one?" "Don't know for certain. But does it matter?" "All 3 died the same way. How do you know?" "How do you know this wasn't what they said?" "An accident." Elias showed him the ledger. sat beside him in that cool darkness, and let the young man read his father's fate in careful handwriting that had survived 2 decades. He watched Hadley's face change as he read, watched shock give way to horror, horror to grief, and finally grief to a cold, hard anger that reminded Elias of high country winters. When Hadley finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Mayor Marsh did this. Judge Crane, Dutch Miller. They killed my father, and 23 miners before that. Red Creek Massacre, you ever hear about it? Yes, Apache raid, I was told. Part of the territory troubles. Wasn't Apaches. Was your father's own sheriff and these prominent citizens. Ambushed the miners, stole the gold, and when your father and the others tried to bring them to justice, they murdered them too. Hadley sat back against the stone wall, the ledger in his lap. Elias could see him struggling to process it all, a lifetime of beliefs crumbling in the space of an hour. My mother, Hadley said suddenly. Did she know? Don't think so. Sarah Kemper suspected, but she was Deputy Morrison's wife. She might have shared her suspicions with your mother, but I can't say for certain. She died 5 years ago, cancer. Her last words to me were about my father, how proud he'd be of me wearing the star. His voice broke. I've been protecting his killers, working for a town they built on blood money. You didn't know. I should have known. Should have asked questions. But it was easier to believe the hero story, wasn't it? Easier to think my father died saving people instead of... He stopped, unable to finish. Elias let him sit with it. A man needed time to grieve, even for a father he'd lost 20 years ago. Maybe especially for that father, because now he was losing him twice, once to death, once to truth. Finally, Hadley stood. What do you want to do? Bring them to justice, but I need help. Can't do it alone, and I've only been in town a week. You're the law here. The law? Hadley laughed bitterly. The law is Judge Crane, who signed my father's death certificate. The law is Mayor Marsh, who controls half the territory. What am I supposed to do against that? What your father would have done. Stand up. Do what's right, even when it's hard. Hadley looked at him, and Elias saw something shift behind the young man's eyes. A decision being made. You're right, Hadley said quietly. He reached out and carefully removed the star from the skeleton closest to him. His father's remains, Elias realized. The young sheriff held it for a long moment, then pinned it to his own chest, right beside his current badge. For you, Dad. I'll finish what you started. They climbed back to the surface together, and this time when they covered the cellar, it was to protect evidence, not hide it. We need a plan, Hadley said. Can't just walk up and arrest them. We need proof that will hold up beyond this town, beyond Crane's jurisdiction. Federal marshals. Would work, but they're days away at Fort Laramie. We send word. It'll take a week minimum for them to get here. And the moment Marsh suspects we're bringing in outside law, he'll run or destroy evidence. So we gather more evidence first. Build a case they can't ignore. And stay alive while doing it, Hadley added grimly. You find anything else suspicious on your land? Just the cellar. But I'm betting there's more to find if we look. The ledger mentions Red Creek. That's a real place? About 15 miles north. Old mining camp been abandoned since the massacre. I could take you there. Tomorrow, Elias said. Today I need to make sure my camp is secure. Someone searched it yesterday while I was in town. Hadley's jaw tightened. They're scared. Good. Scared men make mistakes. They parted with an agreement to meet at dawn the next day. As Elias walked back toward his new camp in the rocks, he felt a grim satisfaction. He had an ally now, the son of one of the murdered deputies, wearing his father's star and ready to fight. But that satisfaction lasted only until he reached his camp and found his water supply poisoned. He'd been careful, as always. His canteen and water barrel were kept in shade, covered against dust and insects. But when he went to refill his canteen, the smell stopped him cold. Bitter almonds. He'd encountered it once in the mountains when a trapper died from drinking contaminated water. Cyanide or something like it. Elias poured the water out carefully, watching it darken the sand. Someone had come here while he was showing Hadley the cellar. Someone who wanted him dead, but was willing to be patient about it. The message was clear. They could reach him any time. His camp wasn't safe. Nothing in Salvation Ridge was safe. He spent the rest of the afternoon moving his camp again, this time to a spot even more remote. A cluster of boulders that formed a natural fortress, with clear sightlines in all directions and only one approach. He'd seen similar formations in the mountains used by trappers who valued their lives. As he worked, he thought about the escalation. First warnings, now poison. Next would be direct violence, hired guns or an ambush. They were working up to killing him, just like they'd worked up to killing the deputies. But Elias had one advantage the deputies hadn't. He knew it was coming. That evening, he made copies of the most important ledger pages, using charcoal and paper he'd bought from Green's store. He sealed the copies in oilcloth and hid them in 3 different locations across the desert, under rocks, in crevices, places only he would remember. If something happened to him and the original ledger, someone could still find the truth. As darkness fell, he sat with his back to the rocks, both deputy stars in his hand. Morrison's and crosses. Hadley had his father's. And these 2 deserved to be remembered too. "Don't know if you boys can hear me," he said to the stars. "To the night, to the memory of men who died for doing right. But I'm going to see this through. Your families deserve to know the truth. Those miners at Red Creek deserve justice. And these men who think they're above the law need to learn they're not." The stars glinted in the moonlight, offering no answer but their silent weight. Elias had learned in his years in the mountains that some fights chose you, whether you wanted them or not. A grizzly stumbling onto your camp, a winter storm that wouldn't let you leave. Men who decided your death was worth their convenience. You didn't get to choose when those fights came. You only got to choose how you faced them. He'd faced this one, standing up. In the darkness beyond his camp, something moved. Elias was on his feet instantly, knife in hand, but it was only a coyote trotting past, hunting for its own survival. The animal paused, looked at him with eyes that caught the moonlight, then continued on its way. Elias watched it go and thought about Sarah Kemper's warning. They're planning something. Well, let them plan. He'd been planning too. And tomorrow, he and Sheriff Hadley would ride to Red Creek and see what other secrets this desert had kept for 20 years. He settled in for another sleepless night, watching the stars wheel overhead, listening to the desert breathe around him. Somewhere in Salvation Ridge, powerful men were probably sleeping soundly in comfortable beds. Convinced their secret was still safe, they were wrong, and by the time Elias Boone was done, everyone would know just how wrong they were. Sheriff Hadley arrived at Elias's new camp just as the sun was breaking over the horizon, painting the desert in shades of copper and rose. The young man looked like he hadn't slept much either. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face drawn with the kind of exhaustion that came from grief rather than physical labor. "Ready?" Hadley asked, his voice rough. "Ready," Elias confirmed, shouldering a small pack with water, food, and the ledger wrapped carefully in oilcloth. They rode north. Elias on a horse borrowed from Sarah Kemper, a sturdy mare that didn't mind the desert heat. Hadley led the way, following what had once been a wagon road, but was now barely visible under years of wind-blown sand. The landscape changed as they traveled. The flat desert gave way to rolling hills cut through with dry arroyos. Scrub brush grew thicker here, and they passed stands of stunted juniper clinging to rocky slopes. The sun climbed higher, and the temperature rose with it. Neither man spoke much. Hadley seemed lost in thought, probably wrestling with everything he'd learned. Elias was content with silence, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain. Old habits from the mountains. Always watch for danger, always know your escape routes. After 2 hours, Hadley reined in his horse at the top of a rise. "There," he said, pointing down into a narrow valley. "Red Creek." Elias could see why they'd chosen this spot for an ambush. The valley was maybe a quarter-mile long, with steep walls on either side. A wagon road ran through the bottom, the only practical route through this terrain. Anyone moving through would be exposed, vulnerable. They descended slowly, and as they got closer, Elias began to see the evidence. Weathered wood from wagon remains, half buried under sand, scattered debris that might have been supplies or equipment, and bones, 20 years in the desert sun and wind had reduced them to fragments, but they were unmistakably human. A skull here, a femur there, a rib cage still partially connected. The remains of men who'd been left where they fell. Jesus, Hadley whispered. I rode through here a year ago chasing rustlers. Didn't even notice. You weren't looking, Elias said. And someone went to some trouble to scatter things, make it look natural. They dismounted and began searching the site methodically. Elias found spent rifle cartridges, dozens of them, positioned in the rocks above the road. Shooting positions for an ambush. He climbed up to one and looked down at the killing ground below. Perfect view. The miners wouldn't have stood a chance. Boone. Hadley called from further down the valley. You need to see this. Elias climbed down and found the sheriff standing beside a cluster of crude wooden crosses, weathered but still standing. 23 of them, arranged in neat rows. Someone had carved numbers into each one, 1 through 23. Someone buried them, Hadley said, his voice thick with emotion. After the massacre, someone came back and gave them graves, and maintained them, Elias added, kneeling beside one of the crosses. The base had been recently reinforced with rocks, and there were signs that the sand had been cleared away not long ago. Someone's been coming here regular. Who would do that? Everyone thinks this was an Apache raid. Someone who knows different. Someone who cares. They found the answer 10 minutes later. Behind a large boulder, sheltered from the wind, was a small cairn of rocks with something tucked inside. Elias carefully dismantled it and found a journal wrapped in oilcloth, remarkably well preserved. The first page answered their question. Journal of Deputy James Hadley, September 1865. Sheriff Hadley's hands trembled as Elias handed it to him. My father's journal. He kept a journal. Looks like it. And it looks like he came here after the massacre. Hadley began reading aloud, his voice breaking occasionally. September 16, 1865. Rode out to Red Creek with Morrison and Cross to investigate reports of an Apache raid. Found 23 bodies, all shot with military-grade rifles. No arrows, no sign of Indian attack. This was no raid, this was murder. Spent the day burying the dead. Cross made markers. Morrison said a prayer over each grave. I can't get their faces out of my mind. They trusted us to protect them. September 17th, searched the ambush site. Found over 60 cartridge casings in the rocks above the road. Professional shooting positions. This was planned. Someone knew the miners were coming through here with their gold. Someone set up an ambush. September 18th, back in Salvation Ridge. Confronted Sheriff Hayes with what we found. He ordered us to let it go, said we don't know what we're dealing with. Morrison pressed him, where's the gold? The miners were carrying over $20,000. Hayes got angry, told us to drop it or face consequences. Something's very wrong here. September 19th, found proof. Dutch Miller bought the lot next to the Silver Spur today, paid in gold coins. Same dates as the coins the Red Creek miners were carrying. We documented them before they left. Morrison wants to arrest Miller, but we need more evidence. Hayes is in on it. We need to be careful. September 20th, meeting tonight. Hayes, Mayor Marsh, Judge Crane, Miller, and others. Cross got close enough to hear some of it. They're dividing the gold. They killed those miners, and they're sitting in the saloon bragging about it. We have to act, but how? Crane controls the courts. Marsh controls the territory. If we make accusations without ironclad proof, we're dead men. September 21st. Gathering evidence. Found the account books in Hayes's office. He's careless when he's drunk. The numbers match up. They stole the gold and they're dividing it up. But Crane offered us money to look the other way. $3,000 each. Morrison wanted to punch him. Cross just shook his head. We refused. Crane said we were making a mistake. He said we should think about our families. September 22nd. They know we won't back down. Hayes has been avoiding us. Marsh is watching us. Morrison wants to ride to Fort Laramie, bring federal marshals. I said we should wait, gather more evidence. But I'm starting to think Morrison's right. These men are dangerous. If something happens to us, I'm hiding this journal at Red Creek. Someone needs to know the truth. Someone needs to tell the families of those 23 miners that it wasn't Apaches. It was their own people. It was greed. If you're reading this and I'm dead, tell my son. The entry ended abruptly, unfinished. The next page was blank. Hadley was crying openly now, clutching his father's journal like a lifeline. He knew they were going to kill him, and he still tried to do the right thing. He did do the right thing, Elias said quietly. Him and Morrison and Cross, they stood up when it mattered, and they died for it. Sometimes that's the price. But they died, knowing they tried, knowing they didn't look away. Hadley wiped his eyes, straightened his shoulders. When he spoke again, his voice was steadier. We need to document all of this. Every grave, every cartridge, everything. Build a case so strong that even Crane can't ignore it. They spent the next 3 hours doing exactly that. Elias sketched maps of the ambush site, noting the positions of the shooting stations and the wagon road. Hadley counted graves and recorded the numbers. They collected cartridge casings, noting the manufacturer's stamps. Everything that could serve as evidence. While they worked, Elias found something else tucked into the journal's pages, a crude map, hand-drawn. It showed Red Creek, the town of Salvation Ridge, and several other locations marked with X's. One X was labeled Evidence, Miller's Cellar. Another read Bank Records, Marsh. A third said Court Documents, Crane. Your father was building a case, Elias said, showing Hadley the map. He'd identified where to find proof against each conspirator, but he never got the chance to collect it. No, but we can. They took the journal with them. It was too valuable to leave, even hidden. As they prepared to leave Red Creek, Hadley paused at the graves one more time. I'll make this right, he said to the crosses, to the bones scattered in the desert, to the memory of 23 men who died for someone else's greed. I promise you that. The ride back was faster than the journey out. Both men were energized by what they'd found, the pieces of the puzzle coming together. But as they approached Salvation Ridge from the north, Elias spotted something that made him rein in his horse, riders, 3 of them heading toward town from the east. Even from a distance, Elias could tell they weren't locals. They sat their horses with a professional ease, and even in the desert heat, they wore long coats that suggested they were carrying more than a single sidearm. Who are they? Hadley asked. Trouble, Elias said. Hired guns, if I'm reading the sign right. You think Marsh sent for them? Seems likely. We've been poking at his secret for 3 days now. He's escalating. They entered town separately, Hadley through the main street, Elias circling around to approach from the south. No point advertising that they'd been together, but it was too late for subtlety. As Elias dismounted at Sarah Kemper's boarding house to return her horse, Dutch Miller stepped out of his saloon across the street. Mr. Boone, Dutch called out, his voice friendly but his eyes hard. Wondered where you'd gotten to. Out enjoying the desert? Seeing the country, Elias replied neutrally. See anything interesting? Sand, rocks, the usual. Dutch smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Funny thing, someone told me they saw you riding north this morning. With our sheriff? Almost like you were heading somewhere specific. Sheriff offered to show me the territory. Seemed neighborly. Dutch let the word hang in the air. Then he gestured toward his saloon. How about you come have a drink with me? On the house. We should talk. It wasn't a request, not really. Elias could refuse, but that would just confirm Dutch's suspicions. Better to see what the man wanted, take his measure up close. Don't mind if I do, Elias said. The saloon was dim and cool after the bright desert sun. A few men sat at tables, but they cleared out quickly when Dutch led Elias to a corner booth. Whatever was about to happen, Dutch wanted privacy for it. A bartender brought whiskey and 2 glasses without being asked. Dutch poured with steady hands. You've caused quite a stir in our little town, Mr. Boone, Dutch said, sliding a glass across the table. In less than a week you've managed to make some powerful people very nervous. Didn't mean to cause trouble, but you have. See, there are certain things in Salvation Ridge that are best left alone. Old history, old tragedies. People have moved on, built good lives. Then you come along digging around where you shouldn't, on my own property. But that's the thing about property in these parts. Land has memory. Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie. Elias took a slow sip of his whiskey. It was good whiskey, expensive. Bought with blood money, most likely. What do you want, Miller? Dutch's friendly facade slipped just for a moment. I want you to leave. Tonight. Take your bedroll and your mule and ride out. We'll even buy your land back, $500. More than fair for worthless desert. And if I don't, then things will get unpleasant. For you, and for anyone who's been helping you. Dutch leaned forward. You think you're the first man to come sniffing around old secrets. Last fellow who got too curious had an accident. Fell off his horse, broke his neck. Very tragic. That a threat. That's history. And a warning. This town takes care of its own, Mr. Boone, but it also knows how to deal with troublemakers. Elias set his glass down carefully. Let me tell you something, Miller. I spent 30 years in the mountains living with grizzlies and wolves. Survived winters that would kill most men. And you know what I learned? The most dangerous predators aren't the ones who roar and show their teeth. They're the ones who sneak around in the dark, taking what isn't theirs. He stood up. I'm not leaving. And you can tell Mayor Marsh and Judge Crane that whatever they're planning, it won't work. The truth's coming out, whether they like it or not. Dutch's face went cold. You're making a mistake. Wouldn't be the first time. But I'll live with it. Elias walked out of the saloon into the afternoon heat, aware of eyes watching him from windows and doorways. The whole town probably knew about the meeting by now. Knew that the mountain man had just told Dutch Miller, and by extension the town's power structure, to go to hell. He found Sheriff Hadley waiting at his office. The young man looked worried. 3 strangers just checked into the boarding house, Hadley said quietly. Paid for a week in advance. Cold-eyed men with guns worn low. Sarah's scared, let her hear from me. Miller just made that clear. Then we need to move fast. Whatever evidence my father marked on that map, we need to get it before they make their move. Elias nodded. Tonight. We'll hit Miller's cellar first, that's closest. But we need to be smart. These men are professionals. I'll deputize some townspeople. Men I trust. No, too risky. If word gets out, those hired guns will be waiting. Just you and me, moving quiet. Hadley started to argue, then stopped. You've done this before, haven't you? Not law work, but I've hunted men in the mountains. Claim jumpers, outlaws hiding in the high country. It's not much different than tracking elk, except the prey shoots back. That should not be as comforting as it is. Despite the tension, Elias smiled. We'll make it work. Your father did his part gathering evidence. Now we finish what he started. As the sun set over Salvation Ridge, painting the wooden buildings in shades of orange and red, Elias prepared for what was coming. Tonight they'd gather more evidence. Tomorrow they'd figure out how to use it. But first they had to survive the night. The sun was barely up when Sheriff Hadley found Elias at his camp. The young man looked haggard, but his eyes burned with purpose. One of the hired guns turned up tied to a rock about an hour ago, Hadley said. Shoulder wound, claiming he was attacked by bandits. You wouldn't know anything about that? Might have run into some trouble last night. Well, the other 2 are looking for you now. Marsh is furious. Apparently he paid good money for professionals, and one of them got taken down by a lone mountain man. Good. Let him be angry. Angry men make mistakes. Hadley sat down, accepted the coffee Elias offered. I've been thinking about our next move. We have Dutch's testimony and documents. We have the ledger and my father's journal. But if we're going to make charges stick, we need something directly from Marsh or Crane. Something they can't explain. A way. Your father's map mentioned Marsh's bank records and Crane's court documents. The bank will be heavily guarded, especially now. But Crane, Hadley paused, thinking. Crane is old, maybe 70. Lives alone in a big house on the edge of town. His office is attached to the courthouse, but he keeps a private study at home, where he does most of his work. Think he'd keep evidence there? Dutch said everyone kept insurance against each other. Makes sense Crane would too. He survived this long by being careful. They decided to approach Judge Crane directly. Not to break in, but to confront him. An old man, alone, facing evidence of crimes committed 20 years ago. There was a chance he might crack, especially if he thought his co-conspirators were turning on him. It was a risk. But everything about this situation was a risk now. They waited until midday, when the heat was at its worst, and most people were indoors. Crane's house was an impressive structure by Salvation Ridge standards. 2 stories, white-painted wood, with a covered porch that suggested wealth and status. A sign beside the door read, "The Honorable Bartholomew Crane, Territorial Judge." Hadley knocked. They waited. After a long moment, the door opened and Judge Crane himself stood there, silver-haired and dignified, in a silk vest and watch chain. "Sheriff Hadley," Crane said, his voice cultivated and educated. "What can I do for you?" "We need to talk, Judge, about Red Creek." Crane's expression didn't change, but Elias saw his knuckles whiten where he gripped the door. "I'm not sure what you mean. I think you do. May we come in?" For a moment, Elias thought Crane would refuse, but then the judge stepped aside. "Very well. Though I must say this is highly irregular. The interior was as impressive as the exterior. Rich carpets, mahogany furniture, law books lining every wall. A man who'd built a life of respectability on blood money. Crane led them to a study off the main hall. "Now what's this about?" Hadley didn't waste time. He laid out everything: the cellar, the ledger, his father's journal, Dutch's confession. With each revelation, Crane grew paler. When Hadley finished, the judge sat down heavily in a leather chair. "I see. That's all you have to say." Hadley's voice was tight with anger. "You signed my father's death certificate. You knew he was murdered and you covered it up." "I was protecting myself," Crane said quietly. "And my family. You have to understand I was young, ambitious. Marsh came to me with an opportunity. Easy money, he said. No one would get hurt. 23 miners died. I didn't know that would happen. None of us did, except maybe Marsh. By the time we realized what he'd done, we were all complicit. And then your father and the other deputies started asking questions. So you killed them too." "I didn't kill anyone," Crane said sharply. Then softer, "But I didn't stop it either. Marsh said it was necessary. Hayes was his man, did what he was told. The rest of us we looked the other way." "You're a judge," Elias said. "You swore an oath." "I know what I am, Mr. Boone. I've known for 20 years. Every case I've presided over, every sentence I've passed. I've wondered if I had any right to judge anyone when I'd done what I did." Crane stood, walked to a painting on the wall, a landscape of the desert mountains. He swung it aside, revealing a wall safe. "September 15th, 1865, he said, working the combination. "The date of Red Creek. I chose it as my combination, so I'd never forget. Every time I open this safe, I'm reminded. The safe opened. Inside were stacks of documents, organized and labeled with meticulous care. I've kept records of everything," Crane said, pulling out ledger after ledger. "Every crime, every cover-up, every payment. 20 years of conspiracy documented in detail. Marsh thinks I'm loyal, but I've been building a case against him, against all of us, since the beginning." He turned to face them, his eyes haunted. "I've been waiting for someone to come asking. Someone who cared enough to dig up the truth. Part of me has wanted to be caught for 20 years. Hadley stared at the mountain of evidence. "Why? Why keep all this if you were just going to stay silent?" "Because I'm a coward, Sheriff. I wanted the possibility of redemption without the courage to seek it actively. I told myself that someday, when the time was right, I'd come forward. But days became years, and years became decades, and here I am, an old man who sold his soul for gold he can't even enjoy." Elias moved closer to examine the documents. There were ledgers similar to the one from the cellar, but these were more complete. They showed not just the Red Creek conspiracy, but 20 years of subsequent crimes. Land fraud, intimidation, at least 6 murders arranged to protect the secret or expand the conspirators' power. One entry made him stop cold. Sarah Kemper's husband, Deputy Morrison. It says here the fire was set by someone named Jack Torres on Marsh's orders. Torres was paid $500. He died 2 years later, Crane said. Killed in a bar fight in Tucson. Convenient for Marsh. One less witness. Hadley was reading another ledger, his face growing darker. "Judge, this shows you've been covering up crimes for Marsh for 2 decades. Property disputes decided in his favor. Criminal charges dismissed. Witnesses intimidated. The corruption goes far beyond Red Creek, I'm aware. Marsh doesn't just control Salvation Ridge, Sheriff. He controls 3 counties. He has territorial officials on his payroll, federal appointments influenced by his money. The man you're trying to bring down has spent 20 years building an empire on that stolen gold. Then how do we stop him? Elias asked. Crane gestured to the documents. You use these, but not locally. Marsh owns too many people here. You need to go over his head. Federal marshals, territorial governor, maybe even Washington. Make the case so public and so damning that he can't buy his way out. Will you testify? The old judge was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. Yes, God help me, yes. I've been a coward long enough. Your father deserves justice, Sheriff. So do those miners. So do all the people Marsh has hurt over the years. There's something else, Crane said, pulling out a final document. Something that changes everything. He handed Elias a faded property deed. In 1866, Marsh bought up most of the mining claims around Red Creek for pennies on the dollar. Told people the area was cursed, dangerous, played on superstition. But he knew something the rest of us didn't. What? There's a second gold vein at Red Creek, larger than the first. He's been mining it secretly for years, through front companies and shell corporations. That stolen $20,000 was just seed money. Marsh has probably taken $500,000 out of those hills, maybe more. Hadley let out a low whistle. So it wasn't just about covering up one crime. It was about protecting an ongoing criminal enterprise. Exactly. And that's not all. Crane pulled out a map, unfolded it on his desk. Marsh has been buying water rights throughout the territory. He's planning something big. I don't know exactly what, but it involves controlling water access to force other ranchers out. He's been doing it for 5 years now, very quietly. Elias studied the map. Red Creek, the town, and dozens of other locations marked with dates and dollar amounts. It showed a pattern of systematic acquisition and control. This is bigger than we thought, Elias said. We're not just exposing a 20-year-old massacre. We're trying to bring down someone who's been building a criminal empire, which is why you need to move fast, Crane said urgently. Marsh is smart and he's paranoid. The moment he realizes I've turned against him, he'll disappear. He has money hidden in banks across 3 territories and probably Mexico. He could vanish and live comfortably for the rest of his life. Then we take him now, Hadley said. Today, we gather everything, ride to Fort Laramie, bring back federal authority. It's not that simple, Crane said. Marsh has people watching the roads. The moment you ride out with evidence, he'll know. Those 2 remaining hired guns will be the least of your problems. He has a dozen men on his payroll who'd kill for him. So what do we do? Hadley asked, frustration clear in his voice. Elias had been thinking while they talked, his mountain man's mind working through the problem like planning a winter trapline. We don't run. We make them come to us. Force a confrontation here in public where Marsh can't make us disappear quietly? How? We tell the truth, all of it. To everyone, Crane looked alarmed. That's suicide. Marsh will have to decide between running and fighting. Either way, he loses. If he runs, it's an admission of guilt. If he fights, we have witnesses. And we have you, Judge. A territorial judge testifying against him carries weight. There's still those hired guns, Hadley pointed out. Leave them to me, Elias said grimly. I dealt with one last night. I can deal with 2 more. Crane walked to his window, looking out at the town he'd helped corrupt. Timothy Worth, the newspaper man. If anyone can spread the word quickly, it's him. He has a printing press in his basement, used to publish the Sentinel before it closed. Could he print broadsides? Hadley asked. Something we could distribute to the whole town? He could, but it would take time. We have tonight, Elias said. We write up the accusations, print them, and tomorrow morning we paper this town with the truth. Force everything into the open, and we hold a public meeting, Hadley added, warming to the idea. In the courthouse square. Present the evidence, let people hear Judge Crane's testimony. Make it impossible for Marsh to silence us without witnesses. He won't come to a public meeting, Crane said. He'll barricade himself in his ranch with his men. Then we go to him after. With a posse. With federal authority on the way. With the whole town knowing what he did. Elias felt the plan taking shape. Question is, Judge, are you really ready to do this? Once we start, there's no going back. Crane looked at him. And Elias saw something shift in the old man's eyes. Decision, resolution, maybe even relief. I'm 72 years old. Mr. Boone, I've lived 20 years longer than those 3 deputies Marsh murdered. Every day has been borrowed time. Time I should have spent in prison for what I did. If I die bringing him down, at least I'll die having done one right thing. You won't die, Hadley said. We'll protect you. Can you protect me from myself, Sheriff? From the weight of 20 years of guilt. Crane gathered the documents, began organizing them. Let's do this properly. Let's build a case so solid that even Marsh's money can't buy him out of it. They spent the rest of the afternoon in Crane's study, organizing evidence and preparing testimony. The judge was meticulous, knowing exactly which documents proved which crimes, how to structure the case for maximum impact. As evening approached, they loaded everything into saddlebags, the original cellar ledger, Deputy Hadley's journal, Dutch's confession, and now Crane's extensive records. It was enough evidence to hang Marsh 10 times over. One more thing, Crane said as they prepared to leave. He pulled a small derringer from his desk drawer. I'm not a young man, but I can still shoot. If Marsh comes for me, I won't go quietly. He won't get the chance, Elias promised. They left through the back door, not wanting to advertise their meeting. But as they emerged into the alley, they found themselves facing the 2 remaining hired guns. Both men had weapons drawn. They'd been waiting. Figured you'd come here eventually, one said. Tall, scarred, with dead eyes. Marsh pays us to think ahead. You're making a mistake, Hadley said, hand moving toward his pistol. Don't, the second gunman warned. We're professionals. You're dead before you clear leather. Maybe, Elias said calmly. But you'll only get one of us. The other 2 will take you down. Worth dying for Marsh's money? The scarred gunman smiled. We don't have to kill all of you. Just you, mountain man. Marsh wants the sheriff alive, wants him to watch while everything falls apart. And the judge, well, Marsh has special plans for traitors. Last chance to walk away, Elias said. We don't walk away from jobs. Time seemed to slow. Elias could see it all play out. The gunman would shoot him first. He was the immediate threat. Hadley would draw, might get one of them. Crane would try to use his derringer. Someone would die, probably multiple someones, but then a voice called out from the end of the alley. Drop your weapons, now. Everyone turned. Sarah Kemper stood there with a rifle leveled at the gunman. She wasn't alone. Timothy Worth was with her. And 3 other townspeople, all armed. This doesn't concern you. Ma'am, the scarred gunman said. My husband was one of the deputies murdered 20 years ago, Sarah said, her voice steady. This concerns me more than anyone. We're taking these men in for questioning, Hadley said, finding his voice. Attempted murder of a peace officer. Drop your weapons or face the consequences. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then slowly, the 2 gunmen lowered their pistols. Smart choice, Elias said, collecting their weapons. Now we're going to walk to the jail nice and quiet. Anyone wants to make trouble, they'll answer to all of us. As they marched the hired guns through town, Elias noticed people watching from windows and doorways. Word would spread fast. By morning, all of Salvation Ridge would know something was happening. At the jail, Hadley locked the gunmen in cells. You're both charged with conspiracy to commit murder. Federal marshals will be here within the week to take you to a proper trial. Marsh will have us out by morning, the scarred one said confidently. Marsh is about to have bigger problems than you 2, Hadley replied. After securing the prisoners, they went to Timothy Worth's house. The old newspaper man listened to everything, his eyes growing wider with each revelation. This is the biggest story in territorial history, he said finally. A 20-year conspiracy, murder, theft on a massive scale. And a territorial judge confessing to it all. Can you print it? Crane asked. Tonight? I can. I'll need help setting type, but I can have broadsides ready by dawn. Then do it, Hadley said. Tell everything. Names, dates, evidence. Make it impossible to ignore. As Worth hurried to prepare his printing press, Elias pulled Hadley aside. This is it. Once those broadsides go up, Marsh will know we're coming for him. He'll either run or make a stand. Let him choose. Either way, justice is coming for him. You ready for this? Really ready? It's going to get violent. Hadley touched the two badges he wore, his own and his father's. My father died trying to do the right thing. I've been a sheriff for 3 years, and I never knew I was protecting his murderers. Yeah, I'm ready. More than ready. They worked through the night. Worth set type and ran his press, while Sarah and the other townspeople helped distribute broadsides throughout Salvation Ridge. By dawn, the truth would be everywhere, and Gideon Marsh would finally face what he'd spent 20 years trying to bury. The sun rose over Salvation Ridge to find the town papered with truth. Every storefront, every hitching post, every public space bore a broadside printed in Timothy Worth's careful type. 20 years of murder and conspiracy exposed. The true story of Red Creek and the deputies who died for justice. Elias watched from a rooftop as people emerged to read. He saw shock, disbelief, anger. Some tore the broadsides down immediately, Marsh's people, no doubt. But others read carefully, then looked toward the mayor's house with new understanding. The broadside laid it all out in stark terms. The Red Creek massacre of 23 miners, the theft of gold, the murder of 3 deputies who tried to stop it, and the names Mayor Gideon Marsh, Judge Bartholomew Crane, Dutch Miller, Silas Calhoun, and the deceased Sheriff John Hayes, everything documented. Everything sourced to the ledger, the journal, and Judge Crane's own confession. At the bottom, an announcement. Public testimony and evidence presentation at noon today. Courthouse Square. All citizens invited to hear the truth. By mid-morning, the town was in chaos. Marsh's house was shuttered tight, armed men visible in the windows. Dutch Miller had closed his saloon and barricaded himself inside. Whether for protection or to avoid facing his neighbors, Elias couldn't say. Judge Crane had moved into the courthouse with Sheriff Hadley, surrounded by townspeople who'd volunteered to protect him. Elias descended from his observation post and made his way to the courthouse. The building was crowded with people, some angry, some frightened, all demanding answers. Hadley stood on the courthouse steps, trying to maintain order. I know you all have questions. That's why we're holding the public presentation at noon. Everything will be explained. Where's Mayor Marsh? Someone shouted.
Why isn't he here defending himself?
Because he's guilty, Sarah Kemper said, stepping forward. My husband Frank Morrison was one of the murdered deputies. I've known the truth for 20 years, and I've had to live in silence. Not anymore. Her words carried weight. Sarah was respected, known for her kindness and hard work. If she said it was true, many believed her. More people gathered as the morning wore on. Elias estimated at least 200 of the town's citizens had assembled in the square by 11 o'clock. He kept watch for trouble, his hand never far from his knife. At 11:30, a rider came galloping in from the east, one of Marsh's ranch hands. He dismounted at Marsh's house, pounded on the door, and was quickly admitted. Through a window, Elias saw heated discussion. They're planning something, he said to Hadley. Let them plan. We have the evidence. We have witnesses. We have the truth. Truth doesn't stop bullets, no, but it stops lies. And lies are what Marsh has built his empire on. At noon precisely, Hadley stepped onto a platform that had been hastily constructed in the square. Judge Crane stood beside him, looking frail but determined. Timothy Worth was there with his camera, ready to document everything. Sarah Kemper stood with a group of other women, wives and widows, of men who'd been hurt by Marsh's corruption over the years. Elias positioned himself where he could watch both the crowd and the approaches to the square. If Marsh was going to make a move, it would be now. Citizens of Salvation Ridge, Hadley began, his young voice carrying across the silent crowd. I know many of you have read the broadsides this morning. I know many of you are confused, angry, and looking for answers. I'm here to give you those answers. He held up his father's journal. This is the journal of Deputy James Hadley, written 20 years ago, my father. He documented a massacre at Red Creek, 23 miners murdered for their gold by men this town trusted. Men in positions of power who used that gold to build the lives they've lived ever since. Murmurs ran through the crowd. Hadley continued, his voice growing stronger. 3 deputies, my father, Frank Morrison, and William Cross, discovered the truth. They refused to be bought off. They refused to stay silent. And for that they were murdered, locked in a cellar and left to die when the Silver Spur Saloon was burned to the ground. The fire wasn't an accident. It was murder. "Where's your proof?" someone shouted. One of Marsh's men, Elias noted. "I'll show you." Hadley produced the cellar ledger, held it high. "This ledger was found in that cellar with my father's body and the bodies of his fellow deputies. It documents everything, the massacre, the theft, the conspiracy. And it names names." He began reading entries aloud, his voice never wavering. The crowd listened in stunned silence as 20 years of lies unraveled before them. When Hadley finished, Judge Crane stepped forward. The old man looked like he'd aged a decade overnight, but his voice was clear. "Everything Sheriff Hadley has said is true." "I know because I was part of it." The crowd erupted in shocked voices. Crane waited for silence, then continued. "In 1865, I was a young judge, ambitious and greedy. Gideon Marsh came to me with an opportunity. Easy money, he said. I didn't know it would lead to murder. I didn't know innocent miners would die. But when they did, I made a choice. I chose to protect myself instead of seeking justice. I signed false death certificates for the 3 deputies. I helped cover up the massacre, and I've lived with that guilt every day for 20 years. Why come forward now?" Someone called out, "Because a brave man bought a piece of worthless desert and found what we'd tried to bury. Because Sheriff Hadley has the courage his father had, the courage I lacked. And because I'm old and I'm tired and I'm done living a lie." Crane pulled out document after document, showing them to the crowd. The property frauds, the intimidation, the additional murders over the years. 20 years of corruption laid bare. Gideon Marsh orchestrated all of it, Crane said. He planned the Red Creek massacre, ordered the deaths of the deputies, and built an empire on blood money. And I helped him. For that, I will face whatever punishment the law demands. But I will not die without telling the truth. The crowd was no longer simply shocked. They were angry. Elias could feel the mood shifting, could sense the town turning against Marsh. That's when the gunshots rang out, 3 shots from a rooftop across the square. One struck the platform near Hadley's feet. One shattered a window behind Crane. The 3rd went wide. Elias had already spotted the shooter, one of Marsh's ranch hands, positioned with a rifle. Before anyone else could react, Elias had his own rifle up, sighted and fired. The shooter dropped his weapon and fell back from the rooftop's edge. "Everyone down!" Hadley shouted.
"Take cover!"
The crowd scattered, people diving behind wagons and into doorways. But Elias saw more movement. Armed men emerging from side streets, at least 8 of them, all wearing the brand of Marsh's ranch on their shirts. "He's making his move," Elias said, working his way toward Hadley and Crane. "Get them inside the courthouse." But before they could move, Gideon Marsh himself rode into the square on a magnificent black horse, flanked by more armed men. He looked every inch the powerful rancher, well-dressed, confident, a man used to being obeyed. "This has gone far enough," Marsh announced, his voice carrying authority. "Sheriff Hadley, you're relieved of duty. Judge Crane, you're clearly senile and unfit to serve. And you, mountain man," he fixed his gaze on Elias, "you're under arrest for trespassing, theft, and assault on my men." "You don't have that authority," Hadley said. "I have all the authority I need. I'm the mayor of this town, and I'm declaring a state of emergency. My men are now the law. Your men are criminals," Crane said. "And so are you." Marsh's expression darkened. "You're a foolish old man who's about to regret his confession. Take them." His men moved forward, but they stopped when they realized they were surrounded. Dozens of townspeople had emerged from cover, many of them armed. Sarah Kemper stood at their head, her rifle pointed at Marsh. "No," she said simply. "You've had power in this town for 20 years, Marsh. That ends today." Other voices joined hers. Men and women Elias had seen around town, people who'd lived under Marsh's shadow for too long. "You killed my brother in that land dispute 3 years ago," one man shouted. "Called it an accident, but I always knew. You forced my father to sell his ranch for half what it was worth," a woman called out. "Drove him to drink himself to death. More voices, more accusations. 20 years of grievances that had been suppressed by fear and power, all coming to light at once. Marsh looked around at the hostile crowd, and for the first time, Elias saw fear in the man's eyes. He'd built an empire on making people afraid. Now he was the one facing a town united against him. "You'll all regret this," Marsh said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "I have friends in the territorial government. I have judges and officials in my pocket." "You can't touch me. We don't have to," Hadley said. "Federal marshals are already on their way from Fort Laramie. They'll be here in 3 days. You can run, but you won't get far. Or you can stay and face justice." "Justice?" Marsh laughed bitterly. "There's no justice in this territory. Only power. And I have more power than all of you combined." "You had power," Elias corrected. "Built on secrets and fear. We took away your secrets. Now the fear belongs to you." For a moment, Elias thought Marsh might actually surrender. The man looked defeated, cornered, out of options. But then Marsh's hand dropped to his pistol, and everything happened at once. Marsh drew, aiming at Judge Crane. If he was going down, he'd take the traitor with him. But Elias was faster, his mountain reflexes honed by decades of survival. His shot took Marsh in the shoulder, spinning him in his saddle. Marsh's men reached for their own weapons, but found themselves facing a wall of armed townspeople. The math was simple, 8 against maybe 50. They slowly raised their hands in surrender. Marsh slumped in his saddle, clutching his wounded shoulder. Blood seeped between his fingers, but the wound wasn't fatal. Hadley approached, gun drawn. "Gideon Marsh, you're under arrest for murder, conspiracy, theft, and about 20 other charges. Get down off that horse." Marsh slid down, landing heavily. He looked around at the faces watching him. People he'd controlled for years, now looking at him with contempt and satisfaction. "You've made a mistake," he said, his voice weak with pain. "All of you. You don't know what you've done. We've done what should have been done 20 years ago," Sarah Kemper said. She walked up to Marsh, looked him in the eye. "My husband tried to stop you. You killed him for it. Now you're going to pay for that." Marsh said nothing. What could he say? The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses willing, the truth finally exposed. As Hadley's volunteers led Marsh toward the jail, Elias felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. They'd done it. Against all odds, a mountain man and a young sheriff had brought down one of the most powerful men in the territory. But it wasn't over yet. Marsh still had resources, still had allies. The fight might not be finished. Judge Crane approached Elias, extending his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Boone, for having the courage to see this through. Thank your conscience, Judge. You're the one who kept the records. You're the one who chose to testify. I spent 20 years as a coward. I'm glad I finally found the courage to do one right thing." Hadley joined them, his young face flushed with the excitement and stress of the confrontation. "We need to secure the evidence. Get statements from everyone who testified today. Worth, can you document all of this?" "Already have," Timothy said, patting his camera. "Photographs, written statements, everything. When the federal marshals arrive, we'll have a case that's airtight." As the afternoon wore on, the town began to process what had happened. Some celebrated, others worried about what came next. A few of Marsh's remaining supporters quietly left town, unwilling to be associated with him now that his crimes were exposed. Sarah organized food for everyone who'd stood with them, turning the courthouse square into an impromptu community gathering. People shared stories of Marsh's abuses over the years, finally free to speak without fear. Dutch Miller emerged from his saloon in the late afternoon, looking haggard. He approached Hadley with his hands visible, no weapon in sight. "I heard what happened," Dutch said quietly. "Heard Marsh tried to kill Judge Crane. Guess that confirms everything I told you last night." "It does. You'll still have to face charges, Dutch, but your cooperation will be noted." "I know. Just thank you for giving me a chance to do the right thing, even if it's 20 years too late." As evening approached, Elias climbed back to his rooftop observation post. From there, he could see the entire town, could watch the sun paint the desert in shades of orange and purple. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a mountain man looking for peace and solitude. Instead, he'd found buried secrets and a fight that needed fighting. He'd helped bring justice for 3 murdered deputies and 23 miners. He'd helped free a town from 20 years of corrupt rule. It wasn't the quiet life he'd planned. But as he sat there watching Salvation Ridge come to terms with its newly revealed history, Elias realized it was something better. It was purpose. It was meaning. It was the knowledge that some fights were worth having, even when you didn't go looking for them. Below, Sheriff Hadley emerged from the courthouse, still wearing both badges, his own and his father's. The young man looked up, spotted Elias on the roof, and raised a hand in acknowledgement. Elias raised his own hand in return. Tomorrow would bring more challenges. They still had to get the evidence to Fort Laramie, still had to ensure Marsh actually faced trial, still had to rebuild a town that had lived under corruption for 2 decades. But tonight, for the first time since arriving in Salvation Ridge, Elias felt like he could actually rest. The immediate danger had passed. The truth was out, and justice, delayed by 20 years, was finally on its way. Silas Calhoun's ranch was an hour's ride north of Salvation Ridge, a sprawling operation that spoke of wealth accumulated over decades. The main house was adobe and timber, built to withstand the desert heat, with a covered porch that offered shade and a commanding view of the approach. Calhoun himself waited on that porch, sitting in a rocking chair like a man receiving expected guests rather than law enforcement. He was in his 70s, white-haired and weathered, with the bearing of someone who'd once been powerful but now felt time's weight. "Sheriff Hadley," Calhoun greeted them as they dismounted. "Judge Crane, and you must be the mountain man who started all this. Come on up. I've got lemonade if you're thirsty." "We're not here for social calls, Mr. Calhoun," Hadley said. "I know why you're here." "Still, no reason we can't be civilized about it." Calhoun gestured to chairs. "Sit, please. I'm too old to crane my neck looking up at you." They sat, though Elias kept his hand near his pistol. Calhoun noticed and smiled slightly. "I'm not going to try anything foolish, Mr. Boone. I sent my men to stop Pike because I've got no interest in dying for Gideon Marsh's mistakes. Or my own, for that matter. Your own mistakes include murdering 23 miners," Judge Crane said quietly. "I know what I did, Bartholomew. I've known for 20 years. Same as you." Calhoun poured lemonade with steady hands. "Difference is, I didn't keep detailed records like you did. I just tried to live with it by building this." Hadley gestured at the ranch. "Blood money turned into cattle and land." "Yes, exactly that. I'm not going to lie to you, Sheriff. I won't pretend I'm better than I am. In 1865, I was 45 years old, struggling to keep a small ranch going, and Gideon Marsh offered me a way out. Easy money, he said. Nobody important would get hurt, he said. 23 people died, Elias said. I know. I was there." Calhoun took a long drink of lemonade, his hand shaking slightly. "I fired shots that day. Killed men. I don't know how many. It all happened so fast, so confused. When it was over, there were bodies everywhere, and Marsh was dividing up gold like it was the most natural thing in the world." "Why come forward now?" Hadley asked. "Because I'm dying." Calhoun said it simply, matter-of-factly. "Cancer. Doctor gives me 6 months, maybe less. I spent 20 years building this ranch, raising cattle, trying to convince myself I'd earned it, honestly. But I'm running out of time to make things right." He stood slowly, walked into the house, and returned with a leather satchel. "Everything I kept. My share of the gold. What's left of it, anyway. Deeds to properties I bought with blood money. A confession I wrote last week detailing my part in Red Creek and the deputy murders. It's all yours." Hadley took the satchel, opened it, and found exactly what Calhoun described. Gold coins, documents, and several pages of careful handwriting. "This is a confession to capital crimes," Hadley said. "You could hang for this. I probably will. Or maybe the cancer will get me first. Either way, I'm done running from it." Calhoun sat back down heavily. "But I want something in return." "You're not in a position to negotiate," Elias said. "Maybe not. But I'm going to ask anyway. My daughter, she's 23, doesn't know anything about Red Creek or the deputies. She thinks her father is an honest rancher who built this place from nothing. I want her to keep that belief. I want her to inherit this ranch, free and clear, not tainted by what I did." "That's not how justice works," Hadley said. "No, but hear me out. The ranch is worth maybe $40,000. Let her keep it. but have her pay restitution to the families of the Red Creek miners. 23 men died. That's about $1,700 per family. Let her make that right over time from the ranch's earnings. That way, justice gets served, and she doesn't lose everything. Judge Crane studied his old friend. You want redemption without full payment. I want my daughter protected from my sins. That's all. They were quiet for a moment. Finally, Hadley spoke. I can't promise anything. The territorial court will decide what happens to your assets. But I'll recommend leniency for your daughter if you cooperate fully. Tell us everything. Not just about Red Creek, but everything Marsh has done since. Calhoun nodded slowly. There's a lot to tell. 20 years of land fraud, intimidation, at least 6 more murders that I know of. Marsh didn't stop with Red Creek. That was just the beginning. He used that gold to buy influence, and he used that influence to take whatever he wanted. For the next hour, Calhoun talked. He detailed property schemes, political corruption, bribes paid to territorial officials. He named names, provided dates, drew maps of Marsh's criminal empire. The water rights, Calhoun said, pulling out another map. That's Marsh's next big play. He's been buying up water access throughout the territory, planning to control it all. Once he does, he can force other ranchers out, buy their land cheap. In 10 years, he'd own half the territory. Not anymore, Hadley said, studying the map. This evidence will stop him. Maybe. But Marsh has powerful friends. Federal judges, senators, even some people in Washington. He's been paying them for years. They'll try to protect him. Let them try, Elias said. The evidence is too strong now. Too many witnesses. Too much documentation. Calhoun looked at Elias with something like respect. You did this, mountain man. You bought that piece of worthless desert and dug up what we buried. 20 years of secrets gone because you couldn't leave well enough alone. Those 3 deputies deserved better than being forgotten in a cellar. Those miners deserved their families knowing the truth. They did. And now they'll get it. Calhoun stood again, this time with difficulty. I'll ride back to town with you. Turn myself in officially. I want to make a statement before the federal marshals arrive. Make sure everything's on record. As they prepared to leave, Calhoun's daughter emerged from the house, a young woman with her father's eyes and an innocent smile. Papa? Who are these men? Just business, sweetheart. I need to ride to town with them. I'll be back. He paused, and Elias saw the lie catch in his throat. I'll be back when I can. She kissed her father's cheek, waved to the visitors, and went back inside. Calhoun watched her go, his face heavy with grief. She's all I did right, he said quietly. Everything else was stained with blood. But her, she's good and decent. Please, Sheriff, whatever happens to me, protect her from the truth if you can. I'll do what I can, Hadley promised. But the truth has a way of coming out. Better she hears it from you than from gossip. Maybe, but not yet. Let me give her a few more days of thinking her father is a good man. They rode back to Salvation Ridge in the afternoon heat, Calhoun on his own horse, surprisingly spry for a man claiming to be dying. Elias watched him carefully, but the rancher made no attempt to escape or cause trouble. At the courthouse, Sarah Kemper was waiting with news. Dutch Miller came by while you were gone. Wants to talk to you, Sheriff. Says he has more information about Marsh's operations. Everyone's turning on him, Hadley observed. Like rats leaving a sinking ship. Can you blame them? Judge Crane asked. Marsh is finished. They're all trying to save themselves now. They locked Calhoun in a cell next to Marsh. The 2 old conspirators looked at each other through the bars, and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or shared regret. You talked, Marsh said. Not an accusation, just a statement. I talked. I'm dying anyway, Gideon. Might as well try to make peace with what I did. There's no peace for men like us. Only judgment, then I'll face it. Same as you. Dutch Miller arrived at sunset, looking like he hadn't slept in days. He brought with him account books from his saloon, showing payments Marsh had made over the years. He's been laundering money through my place, Dutch explained. Gold from his illegal mining operation at Red Creek. He'd bring it in as gambling proceeds or property sales, and I'd deposit it in territorial banks under various names. I've got records of every transaction. Why keep records? Elias asked. Same reason Crane did, insurance. I knew someday Marsh might decide I was a liability. Having proof of his crimes was my protection. Some protection, Hadley said. You're still going to face charges, I know. But at least I'm doing this on my terms now, not his. By nightfall, they had 3 of the original 5 conspirators in custody: Marsh, Calhoun, and Miller. Judge Crane was cooperating as a witness. Only the deceased Sheriff Hayes was beyond justice. Elias stood on the courthouse steps, looking out at Salvation Ridge in the fading light. In less than 2 weeks, this town had been turned inside out. Secrets exposed, power structures destroyed, justice finally coming for crimes 20 years old. Tomorrow, they'd begin the formal process, taking statements, organizing evidence, preparing for the federal marshal's arrival. The legal machinery would grind forward, slow but inexorable. But tonight, for the first time since finding that cellar, Elias felt like the hardest part was over. The fighting was done. The truth was out. Now it was just a matter of making sure justice followed through. Sheriff Hadley joined him on the steps, both badges still pinned to his chest, his own and his father's. "Think we'll make it stick?" Hadley asked. "Think the courts will actually convict them? With this much evidence and this many witnesses, they'd have to. Even corrupt judges can't ignore something this big and this public. I hope you're right. Your father hoped the same thing 20 years ago. Difference is this time the evidence won't be buried. This time the truth survives." They stood in companionable silence as stars began to appear overhead. The desert night was cool and peaceful, and for once, Elias allowed himself to enjoy it. 3 deputy stars sat in his pocket now, Morrison's, Cross's and Hadley's, 3 men who'd died for justice. Tomorrow, those stars would go to the territorial authorities as evidence. But tonight, Elias held them one more time, feeling their weight. "We did it," he said quietly to the stars, "to the memory of men who died trying. Took 20 years, but we did it. You can rest now." The stars glinted in the lamplight, offering no answer but their silent presence, a reminder of sacrifice, courage, and the price of standing for what's right, even when it costs everything. 3 weeks had passed since the federal marshals arrived from Fort Laramie, and Salvation Ridge was still finding its footing. The marshals had taken custody of Marsh, Calhoun, and Miller, transporting them to the territorial capital for trial. The evidence had gone with them: mountains of documents, testimony from multiple witnesses, and physical proof that couldn't be denied. Elias stood at the site where it had all begun, his $200 plot of desert that had hidden 20 years of secrets. The cellar was open now, no longer sealed away. The 3 deputies' remains had been exhumed properly, with ceremony and respect, and reburied in the town cemetery under markers that told the truth about how they died. He'd attended the funeral. Most of the town had. Sheriff Hadley had given a eulogy for his father that left nobody with dry eyes, talking about a man he'd never really known, but had come to understand through journals and ledgers and the testimony of those who'd stood with him. Sarah Kemper had wept over her husband's grave, finally able to mourn him honestly after 20 years of living with lies. She'd placed flowers on all 3 graves, Morrison, Cross, and Hadley, 3 men who'd tried to do right and paid with their lives. Now, Elias was building. The cabin he'd originally planned had evolved into something more, a small but solid structure using timber and stone, incorporating some of the old saloon's foundation. It felt right somehow, building something new on top of what had been destroyed. "Coming along nicely," a voice said behind him. Elias turned to find Sheriff Hadley approaching, still wearing both badges. The young man had aged in the past few weeks, but in a good way, the kind of aging that came from responsibility shouldered and challenges met. "Getting there," Elias agreed. "Should be finished by winter. You're staying then?" "I'd wondered if you might head back to the mountains once the trial was over." Elias considered the question. He'd wondered the same thing. The mountains had been his home for 30 years, but something had changed in him these past weeks. Or maybe he'd changed long before and only now recognized it. "Figure I'll stay. Town could use someone who's not afraid to dig up the truth when it needs digging." Hadley smiled. "Town could use that. Speaking of which, Territorial Governor sent a letter. Wants to appoint you official deputy. Seems word's gotten out about what you did here. I'm not a lawman. Neither was I, really. Not until I had to be. Hadley looked out at the desert, at the town beyond. Crane's testifying next week at the Territorial Capital. Prosecution says his cooperation will likely reduce his sentence, but he's still looking at prison time. He seems almost relieved about it. He carried that guilt for 20 years. Prison might feel like freedom compared to that. Dutch, too, says he'll serve whatever time they give him. Calhoun, Hadley paused. Calhoun died 3 days ago. The cancer moved fast. He gave a full deposition before he went, made sure everything was on record. Elias absorbed the news. He felt no satisfaction in Calhoun's death, just a sense of completion. The man had faced his crimes in the end. That was something. What about his daughter? The ranch. Working that out with the courts. She'll likely keep the property, but pay restitution to the victims' families, like her father wanted. She knows the truth now. Calhoun told her everything before he died. She took it hard, but said she'd make it right. That's all anyone can do. Make it right when you can. They were quiet for a moment, watching a hawk circle overhead, riding the thermal currents. The Red Creek Memorial Ceremony is tomorrow, Hadley said. Wanted to make sure you'd be there. Timothy Worth is documenting everything for the Territorial Archives, and Zara's arranged for markers with all 23 miners' names. I'll be there. Good, you should be. None of this happens without you buying this plot of dirt. After Hadley left, Elias returned to his building. He'd been working on a particular feature, a stone mantle above where his fireplace would be. Carved into that mantle were 3 names: Deputy James Hadley, Deputy Frank Morrison, Deputy William Cross, and 3 stars mounted above them. Permanently displayed, Sarah Kemper had given him Morrison's star to keep. Hadley had offered his father's, but Elias had declined. That belonged with the young sheriff. But Cross's star, recovered from the cellar, had no family to claim it. So Elias had taken it, along with the 2 he'd found initially, and placed all 3 here where they'd be seen and remembered. A legacy carved in stone. A promise that truth mattered, that justice, however delayed, was worth fighting for. As he worked, a rider approached. Elias recognized the horse before he saw the rider. It was Sarah's mare, and Sarah herself was in the saddle, riding with the easy confidence of someone who'd lived in this country all her life. "Mr. Boone," she greeted him, dismounting. "Brought you some lunch. Figured you'd be too busy building to remember to eat." She'd been doing that a lot lately, bringing him food, checking on his progress, staying to talk. Sometimes about her husband and the memories she'd finally been able to process. Sometimes about the town and how it was healing. Sometimes about nothing much at all. Just comfortable silence shared between 2 people who'd been through something together. "Much obliged," Elias said, accepting the basket. "Want to stay?" "Got coffee on?" "I'd like that." They sat on what would become his porch, eating sandwiches and drinking coffee, watching the desert shimmer in the afternoon heat. It was peaceful in a way Elias hadn't expected to find when he'd first bought this land. "The boarding house is doing well," Sarah said. "With all the attention Salvation Ridge has been getting, we've had more visitors than ever. Newspaper people, territorial officials, even a writer from back east who wants to document the whole story. You going to talk to him?" "Already did. Told him everything. About Frank, about living with the lie, about finally getting justice. Felt good to say it all out loud to someone who'll put it in print. Frank deserves to be remembered as a hero, not just a name on a death certificate. He will be. They all will." Sarah looked at the 3 stars mounted on Elias's mantle. "You're building a memorial." "Something like that." "Seemed right. They stood their ground here, died here. Should be remembered here." Frank would have liked that. He always said the most important thing about being a lawman wasn't the badge. It was standing for something when it mattered. She smiled sadly. "I was so angry at him that last night. He knew they were coming for him, knew he might die, but he wouldn't back down. I begged him to run, to take our baby and leave. He just kissed me and said some things were worth dying for. He was right, I know. Didn't make it easier then, doesn't make it easier now. But at least now everyone knows why he died. That helps. The afternoon wore on. Sarah eventually left to run her boarding house, promising to return the next day for the ride to Red Creek. Elias finished his work for the day and sat watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of copper and gold. The next morning dawned clear and cool. A procession formed in Salvation Ridge, maybe 100 people all riding or walking north to Red Creek. Sheriff Hadley led them, carrying his father's journal. Sarah Kemper rode beside him, carrying flowers for all 23 graves. Timothy Worth brought his camera. Judge Crane, released temporarily for the ceremony, came despite his age and the weight of his crimes. At Red Creek, the graves had been cleaned and reinforced. New crosses stood where the old ones had weathered, each bearing a name that Timothy had researched from mining camp records. 23 men who'd been erased from history, now given their identities back. A large granite marker stood at the head of the graves, its inscription clear and permanent. Here lie 23 miners, massacred September 15, 1865, while transporting lawful gold. And here are remembered 3 deputies who died seeking justice for them: Deputy James Hadley, Deputy Frank Morrison, Deputy William Cross. Truth buried, but not lost. Justice delayed, but delivered. Their sacrifice is not forgotten. Sheriff Hadley spoke first, reading from his father's journal about the investigation, the evidence gathered, the determination to do right even in the face of death. His voice broke several times, but he pushed through. Sarah spoke about her husband, about the man he'd been and the values he'd lived by, about raising their child alone, never knowing if she was honoring a hero or mourning a fool. Now she knew. 3 weeks had passed since the federal marshals arrived from Fort Laramie, and Salvation Ridge was still finding its footing. The marshals had taken custody of Marsh, Calhoun, and Miller, transporting them to the territorial capital for trial. The evidence had gone with them: mountains of documents, testimony from multiple witnesses, and physical proof that couldn't be denied. Elias stood at the site where it had all begun, his $200 plot of desert that had hidden 20 years of secrets. The cellar was open now, no longer sealed away. The 3 deputies' remains had been exhumed properly, with ceremony and respect, and reburied in the town cemetery under markers that told the truth about how they died. He'd attended the funeral. Most of the town had. Sheriff Hadley had given a eulogy for his father that left nobody with dry eyes, talking about a man he'd never really known, but had come to understand through journals and ledgers and the testimony of those who'd stood with him. Sarah Kemper had wept over her husband's grave, finally able to mourn him honestly after 20 years of living with lies. She'd placed flowers on all 3 graves: Morrison, Cross, and Hadley, 3 men who'd tried to do right and paid with their lives. Now Elias was building. The cabin he'd originally planned had evolved into something more, a small but solid structure using timber and stone, incorporating some of the old saloon's foundation. It felt right somehow, building something new on top of what had been destroyed. Coming along nicely, a voice said behind him. Elias turned to find Sheriff Hadley approaching, still wearing both badges. The young man had aged in the past few weeks, but in a good way. The kind of aging that came from responsibility shouldered and challenges met. Getting there, Elias agreed. Should be finished by winter. You're staying then? I'd wondered if you might head back to the mountains once the trial was over. Elias considered the question. He'd wondered the same thing. The mountains had been his home for 30 years, but something had changed in him these past weeks. Or maybe he'd changed long before and only now recognized it. Figure I'll stay. Town could use someone who's not afraid to dig up the truth when it needs digging. Hadley smiled. Town could use that. Speaking of which, Territorial Governor sent a letter. Wants to appoint you official deputy. Seems word's gotten out about what you did here. I'm not a lawman. Neither was I, really. Not until I had to be. Hadley looked out at the desert, at the town beyond. Crane's testifying next week at the territorial capital. Prosecution says his cooperation will likely reduce his sentence, but he's still looking at prison time. He seems almost relieved about it. He carried that guilt for 20 years. Prison might feel like freedom compared to that. Dutch, too. Says he'll serve whatever time they give him. Calhoun, Hadley paused. Calhoun died 3 days ago. The cancer moved fast. He gave a full deposition before he went, made sure everything was on record. Elias absorbed the news. He felt no satisfaction in Calhoun's death, just a sense of completion. The man had faced his crimes in the end. That was something. What about his daughter? The ranch? Working that out with the courts. She'll likely keep the property, but pay restitution to the victims' families like her father wanted. She knows the truth now. Calhoun told her everything before he died. She took it hard, but said she'd make it right. That's all anyone can do. Make it right when you can. They were quiet for a moment, watching a hawk circle overhead, riding the thermal currents. The Red Creek Memorial Ceremony is tomorrow, Hadley said. Wanted to make sure you'd be there. Timothy Worth is documenting everything for the Territorial Archives. And Sarah's arranged for markers with all 23 miners' names. I'll be there. Good, you should be. None of this happens without you buying this plot of dirt. After Hadley left, Elias returned to his building. He'd been working on a particular feature, a stone mantel above where his fireplace would be. Carved into that mantel were 3 names: Deputy James Hadley, Deputy Frank Morrison, Deputy William Cross, and 3 stars mounted above them. Permanently displayed, Sarah Kemper had given him Morrison's star to keep. Hadley had offered his father's, but Elias had declined. That belonged with the young sheriff. But Cross's star, recovered from the cellar, had no family to claim it. So Elias had taken it, along with the 2 he'd found initially, and placed all 3 here where they'd be seen and remembered. A legacy carved in stone. A promise that truth mattered, that justice, however delayed, was worth fighting for. As he worked, a rider approached. Elias recognized the horse before he saw the rider. It was Sarah's mare, and Sarah herself was in the saddle, riding with the easy confidence of someone who'd lived in this country all her life. "Mr. Boone," she greeted him, dismounting. "Brought you some lunch. Figured you'd be too busy building to remember to eat." She'd been doing that a lot lately, bringing him food, checking on his progress, staying to talk. Sometimes about her husband and the memories she'd finally been able to process. Sometimes about the town and how it was healing. Sometimes about nothing much at all, just comfortable silence shared between 2 people who'd been through something together. "Much obliged," Elias said, accepting the basket.
Want to stay?
"Got coffee on?" "I'd like that." They sat on what would become his porch, eating sandwiches and drinking coffee, watching the desert shimmer in the afternoon heat. It was peaceful in a way Elias hadn't expected to find when he'd first bought this land. "The boarding house is doing well," Sarah said. "With all the attention Salvation Ridge has been getting, we've had more visitors than ever. Newspaper people, territorial officials, even a writer from back east who wants to document the whole story. You going to talk to him?" "Already did. Told him everything. About Frank, about living with the lie, about finally getting justice. Felt good to say it all out loud to someone who'll put it in print. Frank deserves to be remembered as a hero, not just a name on a death certificate. He will be. They all will." Sarah looked at the 3 stars mounted on Elias's mantle. "You're building a memorial." "Something like that." Seemed right. They stood their ground here. Died here. Should be remembered here. Frank would have liked that. He always said the most important thing about being a lawman wasn't the badge. It was standing for something when it mattered. She smiled sadly. "I was so angry at him that last night. He knew they were coming for him, knew he might die, but he wouldn't back down. I begged him to run, to take our baby and leave. He just kissed me and said some things were worth dying for. He was right, I know. Didn't make it easier then, doesn't make it easier now. But at least now everyone knows why he died. That helps." The afternoon wore on. Sarah eventually left to run her boarding house, promising to return the next day for the ride to Red Creek. Elias finished his work for the day and sat watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of copper and gold. The next morning dawned clear and cool. A procession formed in Salvation Ridge. maybe 100 people, all riding or walking north to Red Creek. Sheriff Hadley led them, carrying his father's journal. Sarah Kemper rode beside him, carrying flowers for all 23 graves. Timothy Worth brought his camera. Judge Crane, released temporarily for the ceremony, came despite his age and the weight of his crimes. At Red Creek, the graves had been cleaned and reinforced. New crosses stood where the old ones had weathered, each bearing a name that Timothy had researched from mining camp records. 23 men who'd been erased from history. Now given their identities back, a large granite marker stood at the head of the graves, its inscription clear and permanent. Here lie 23 miners, massacred September 15th, 1865, while transporting lawful gold. And here are remembered 3 deputies who died seeking justice for them. Deputy James Hadley, Deputy Frank Morrison, Deputy William Cross. Truth buried, but not lost. Justice delayed, but delivered. Their sacrifice is not forgotten. Sheriff Hadley spoke first, reading from his father's journal about the investigation, the evidence gathered, the determination to do right, even in the face of death. His voice broke several times, but he pushed through. Sarah spoke about her husband, about the man he'd been and the values he'd lived by, about raising their child alone, never knowing if she was honoring a hero or mourning a fool. Now she knew. Judge Crane gave the most powerful testimony, his old voice carrying across the desert. I helped kill these men. I signed documents that erased their murder, that turned heroes into victims of an accident. I did this because I was a coward, because I valued my own comfort over truth. I tell you this not for forgiveness, I don't deserve it, but as a warning. Evil doesn't always wear an obvious face. Sometimes it looks like opportunity, like practical necessity, like a choice that seems small at the time. But small compromises lead to great crimes. These 26 men died because good people made bad choices and then spent 20 years defending those choices instead of facing them. He paused, looking at the graves. I'm going to prison for what I did. I should have gone 20 years ago. But at least now these men can rest knowing the truth is known. That's more than I deserve, but it's what they earned. Elias was the last to speak. He kept it simple. I'm just a mountain man who bought some land. Didn't come here looking for justice or trying to right old wrongs. But I found 3 men in a cellar who died for doing what was right, and I couldn't let that stand. None of us could. So we dug up the truth, and we made sure these men got the recognition they deserved. That's all any of us can do. Stand up when it matters, do right when we can, and honor those who came before us who did the same. After the ceremony, people lingered, placing flowers on graves, talking quietly among themselves. Some of the older residents shared memories of the miners they'd known, stories that had been suppressed for 2 decades. As the crowd began to disperse, Elias found himself standing with Hadley and Sarah at the memorial stone. Your father would be proud, Elias said to the sheriff. Both of what you did and the man you've become, I hope so. I keep thinking about what it must have been like for him, knowing what was coming, knowing he might die, but doing it anyway because it was right. That's courage, Sarah said. Real courage. Not the absence of fear, but doing what needs doing, despite the fear. They stood together in the desert silence, 3 people bonded by shared struggle and loss. Finally, they mounted up and began the ride back to Salvation Ridge. The town looked different to Elias now, not just in the physical changes. Dutch's saloon being sold, Marsh's house standing empty, new businesses opening to replace the ones built on corruption. But in the feeling of the place, there was an honesty here now, a willingness to face hard truths and build something better. Over the following weeks, Elias settled into his new life. He finished his cabin, simple but solid, with that stone mantel bearing 3 names and 3 stars. Sarah visited often, and gradually their friendship deepened into something more, not a replacement for what she'd lost, but something new, built on shared understanding and mutual respect. Sheriff Hadley grew into his role, earning the respect not through his father's legacy, but through his own actions. The town looked to him for leadership, and he provided it with fairness and wisdom beyond his years. Judge Crane's trial resulted in a 10-year sentence, reduced because of his cooperation. Marsh received life in prison. Dutch Miller got 5 years. The territorial governor pardoned Calhoun posthumously at his daughter's request, allowing her to make restitution without the stain of her father's conviction. The stolen gold, what could be recovered, was distributed to the miners' families or their descendants. It wasn't much after 20 years, but it was something. An acknowledgement that they'd been wronged and that the territory recognized it. One evening, 6 months after that first discovery, Elias sat on his completed porch, watching the sun set over the desert. His bone-handled knife rested on the table beside him, the knife his father had given him 40 years ago. Companion through 3 decades in the mountains, Sarah sat beside him, comfortable in the silence. They'd been talking about the future, about possibilities neither had expected at their age. "You ever miss the mountains?" she asked. "Sometimes. But this is good too. Different but good. What made you stay?" "Really?" Elias thought about it. "Those 3 deputies. They stood for something when it mattered. Died for it. I spent 30 years in the mountains avoiding people, avoiding complications. Then I stumbled on their story and I realized sometimes avoiding things isn't living. It's just existing. Those men lived. They stood for something. I wanted to do the same, even if it was 20 years late. It wasn't too late. Justice delayed isn't the same as justice denied." "No, I suppose it's not." They sat watching the stars emerge. The same stars that had looked down on this desert for millennia, witnessing everything and judging nothing. The wind carried the scent of sage and possibility. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out the deed to his land, that $200 piece of paper that had changed everything. He looked at it in the lamplight, remembering the day he'd bought it, the laughter of townspeople who thought him a fool. "Best $200 I ever spent," he said quietly. Sarah smiled. "I'd say we all got our money's worth out of that purchase." In the distance, they could see the lights of Salvation Ridge, a town reborn, built now on truth instead of lies. It would face challenges ahead, all towns did, but it would face them honestly, with leaders who'd learned the cost of corruption and citizens who'd learned the value of standing up. And on the edge of town, in a simple cabin built on ground that had held terrible secrets, a mountain man had found something he hadn't known he was looking for. Not just justice for the dead, though that mattered. Not just a home in the desert, though that was good too. He'd found purpose. He'd found that even at 58, even after 30 years of solitude, a man could still make a difference, could still stand for something, could still matter. The 3 deputy stars gleamed on his mantle, catching the lamplight. Morrison, Cross, and Hadley, 3 men who'd paid the ultimate price for doing right. Their story would be told now, passed down through generations. The memorial at Red Creek would stand for decades, maybe centuries, reminding people that courage and justice mattered. That was enough. That was more than enough. As full darkness settled over the desert, Elias allowed himself something he hadn't felt in years: contentment. Not just survival, not just existence, but genuine peace earned through struggle and sacrifice. The desert wind whispered across the sand, carrying no more secrets now. Just the promise of tomorrow, and the memory of those who'd stood their ground when it mattered most, and in a simple cabin built on $200 worth of truth, a mountain man closed his eyes and slept the sleep of the just.